Welcome to the FCICA Educational Webinar Series. We are pleased to have Steven Newbrough and Dr. Brian Suddaby from ARDEX Americas with us today. Steven, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Again, I'm Steven Newbrough. I work here in the technical department of ARDEX Americas with a specific focus on environmental programs. Dr. Brian Suddaby here is a senior formulation chemist with a specific focus on all things regulation, trying to make sure that we're compliant with any kind of regulations that are required of us. So it's safe to say for the past 2 years or more now, we've been up to our elbows in all things silica, trying to learn about what it takes to be compliant. And basically, we wanted to join you all here today and talk about what we've gone through as a company in order to make sure that we're compliant with the new crystalline silica OSHA regulation. So we wanted to first extend a welcome to you and also state that we're talking to you today basically because we have had to follow the same type of OSHA regulation that installers have to adhere to. So basically, we're not speaking on behalf of OSHA. We're not speaking on behalf of even any kind of regulatory enforcer or any kind of inspection agency. We're just talking on behalf of ourselves to discuss the different things that we've had to do to make ourselves compliant. We wanted to share our experiences with you. So that being said, we're going to go through everything today. We're going to talk about crystalline silica. We'll talk about the new regulation, and we'll talk about what we've done to ensure that we as a company have been compliant. We wanted to share that with you to help you become compliant as well. So to go over the agenda very, very quickly, we're going to cover a brief overview of silica dust. We'll talk about key provisions of the rule, silica dust control methods, and then finally best practices for compliance. So the OSHA directive statement, the employer shall ensure that no employee is exposed to an airborne concentration of respirable crystalline silica in excess of 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air, averaged over an 8-hour day. So in general, the standard requires employees to limit worker exposures to respirable crystalline silica and to take other steps to protect workers. And it's important to understand that it's the employer's responsibility to protect their own workers from exposure to harmful airborne respirable crystalline silica.
Hi, this is Brian Suddaby. I'm going to start talking about the silica, and we called it a brief introduction to information about silica. I could talk all day about it, but we'll try to teach you only the stuff that is necessary or relevant. So what is silica? In its simplest form, it is silicon dioxide. Silica is most commonly seen as sand. That's another way to think about it. Silica is also a component in many types of rocks and soil. Construction materials such as concrete, tiles, and bricks have silica-containing components in them. When silica is in crystalline form, very small particles can damage your lungs when inhaled. By the way, glass is also made of silica, but it is not crystalline and does not pose the same health hazards. Fine particles of sand are considered a nuisance dust by OSHA. Many of the most common construction materials contain silica. Cement powder, concrete, stone, brick, sand, and many other construction materials contain silica dust. Because these materials contain silica, many of the operations performed by construction workers can release that silica dust into the air. Operations such as mixing cement powder, saw cutting concrete, grinding, jackhammering, and drilling on concrete. Sandblasting also puts lots of dust in the air. I've already mentioned that small particles of crystalline silica can damage your lungs. Particles that are larger than 10 microns, that's 0.4 mils or more, only enter the large air spaces of the lungs, where they get trapped in the mucus and are eventually coughed up out of the lungs. But smaller particles, 10 microns or less, are small enough to enter the alveoli, the tiny sacs in the lungs where oxygen enters the blood and carbon dioxide is released. These respirable particles are too small to see by the naked eye. They can't be ejected, and they cause much damage in the lungs. The body tries to wall off the irritant, and the lung loses elasticity and the ability to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. At this point, I want to simplify my terminology by calling these small particles silica dust instead of respirable crystalline silica. A little bit less of a mouthful. Over the years, scar tissue builds up inside the lungs, causing a condition called silicosis. The effects are similar to the black lung disease seen in coal miners. Silicosis can occur within a few years if the exposure to silica dust is very high. More typically, the disease takes many years to develop when exposures are to more moderate levels. The damage caused by silicosis can also open the door to other lung problems, including infections such as tuberculosis. Long-term exposure to silica dust can cause other health problems, notably lung cancer. I think I've given convincing reasons why it is important to reduce exposures to silica dust. Now let's look at the steps OSHA wants employers and workers to take to reduce their exposure. One thing to keep in mind is that even low levels of silica dust exposure could cause some harm. For this reason, OSHA encourages all workers to minimize their exposure. So where do you draw the line? The level where exposure means that the worker is overexposed. In keeping with the tradition of government bureaucracy, OSHA chose to draw two lines. The higher exposure limit is the permissible exposure limit, or PEL, of 50 micrograms per cubic meter for silica dust that is a respirable size. It's the responsibility of the employer to keep worker exposure below this permissible exposure limit. OSHA also created an action level for respirable silica dust at 25 micrograms per cubic meter. There are some measures in the OSHA standard for silica which encourage lowering exposures below the action level, but they are not as severe as the measures for exposure levels above the PEL. Since you can't see respirable particles in the air, you should assume that the visible dust is accompanied by respirable dust, and you could be overexposed. I'd like to go into more detail about the time-weighted average. Chances are most construction workers will do multiple tasks during the workday, and each task has a different risk of exposure to silica dust. The time-weighted average takes the exposure level for each task, multiplies it by the fraction of the workday spent on that task, then adds up all the segments for calculating the time-weighted average. For example, say a worker spends 4 hours of the workday doing a task that generates airborne respirable crystalline silica at 100 micrograms per cubic meter. That same worker then spends 4 hours doing a task that has 0 exposure to silica dust. Half the day at 100, half the day at 0, that worker's time-weighted average would be 50 micrograms per cubic meter. If any of you are having flashbacks to a middle school teacher telling you how important math will be in your daily life, I feel your pain. However, the point of telling you about this is not to make you add a calculator to your toolbox. The site supervisor can adjust work schedules to keep each worker's time-weighted average below the OSHA permissible exposure limit. Rather than have one worker spend the entire day doing the dustiest job, splitting that job up among several workers and having those workers do other tasks with less exposure on the same day will spread out the exposure so that no one is overexposed. There are three ways to determine what exposure to silica dust a worker has. You can pay an industrial hygienist to monitor for respirable silica. It is expensive, but you get an actual measure of the silica dust exposure during your work process. However, it is preferred to get your exposure data from someone else. Let them pay for it. Many equipment suppliers make their test results available as objective data, published so everyone can use it. Keep in mind that objective data is specific to the equipment used. The information is only useful if you use that manufacturer's drill, saw, vacuum system, etc. To avoid the expense of exposure monitoring, you may need to buy new equipment that has objective data that shows the worker's exposure will be below the action level. The third method of determining exposure level is to use the data in Table 1, which we will get to shortly.
All right, so just as a point of reference, the old OSHA standards for silica exposure set the permissible exposure limit for construction workers at 250 micrograms per cubic meter and 100 micrograms per cubic meter for general industry. And after collecting data for about 40 years or so with those old standards, OSHA decided that too many workers were still suffering from silicosis and lung cancer. So OSHA reduced the permissible exposure limit, and they also added the action level to reduce exposures even further. So you'll notice on the table that the permissible exposure limit and action level break the possible exposure levels into three ranges. The first is below the action level, then above the action level, but below the permissible exposure level, and finally above the permissible exposure level. In a few minutes, I'll get into the difference between these two levels, but first I want to point out that the enforcement dates for the two OSHA silica standards, the construction standard for silica became enforceable last year, September 23rd, 2017. And the general industry standard for silica will be enforceable on June 23rd, 2018. The main difference between the construction and the general industry standards for silica is the Table 1 that's offered for construction. So we're going to examine how Table 1 helps construction workers comply with the regulation. So what is Table 1? Rather than to force each construction company to test their workers for silica dust exposure, OSHA identified common tasks done in many construction jobs and summarized a best practices method for controlling silica dust. If you follow the conditions as described in Table 1, you do not need to test for silica dust for that task. So to look at a couple examples, the first column here describes the equipment or the task. The second column describes the control methods that are used to reduce exposure to silica dust. And the third and fourth columns tell you if respiratory protection must be worn, which may depend on how long a task is being performed. So when you use Table 1 data as part of your silica exposure control plan, the worker has to use equipment exactly as specified in column 2, and the worker has to use respiratory protection as described in columns 3 and 4. So although I don't have time to get into all the specifics of the OSHA standards for silica, I can tell you that life is simpler if you can document that your worker's exposure to respirable crystalline silica is below the action level. That's the 25 micrograms per cubic meter of air. Being above the action level means you have to take action. You have to do more testing. You have to document steps that you've taken to reduce exposure to silica. If your workers are above the permissible exposure limit, that's the 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air, then they'll need to wear respiratory protection, which may trigger the requirement for the expensive medical surveillance program. This brings us to discussing control measures that are used to reduce exposure. Here we have 4 types of engineering control, or I'm sorry, just control measures in general, which are used to reduce exposures to silica dust. And they include engineering controls, which use equipment to keep silica dust out of the air or away from workers. They include work practices, which are the procedures that workers must follow to further protect themselves from silica dust. And work practices instruct the workers on how to do certain tasks in a safe manner. There are also housekeeping rules that cover more general procedures that are common to all work sites. And then as a last resort, when the 3 other control methods don't provide enough protection, a worker's going to need to wear personal protective equipment, PPE. And in this case, we're talking about respiratory protection specifically. Engineering controls, the first line of defense from silica exposure. Engineering controls use equipment that take the dust away from the air that the workers are breathing. And when properly done, engineering controls are automatic. The worker doesn't have to take any action to make them work. Examples of engineering controls are physical barriers such as walls, ventilation equipment, or local exhaust ventilation, which is basically the shop vac that you've used for years, but with one exception. Your old shop vac has a filter on it where the pore sizes of the filter are larger than those of airborne respirable crystalline silica dust. So when you use your old shop vac, it'll pull in all the dusty air, it'll filter out the large particles that you can see, but it pushes all of those small particles that you cannot see back into the air that you're breathing. And as we spoke about earlier, it's those respirable particles that aren't visible to the naked eye that are the most dangerous. So in order to trap all of those small particles, you'll need to use a HEPA filter, which is designed to fit on your vacuum system. Even though the slide has an open window and a fan as visuals, they're not reliable means to completely remove the silica dust that you can't see in the air. And there are some other types of engineering controls, such as water spray on a saw or a vacuum shroud on a drill. And in the case of the water spray, make sure that flooding the work site with water is not going to cause problems with the materials that you're working with. And that includes both materials that you mix and apply on site and any kind of materials that might compose the substrate. All right. We want to make sure that the control methods that we're using aren't going to damage the work that we're doing. Work practices. These are procedures that workers have to follow to reduce exposure. An example of a work practice that you already use is to wear safety glasses whenever a process generates dust. Some new work practices will need to be added to your current procedures to further reduce exposure to silica dust. All right. We want to make sure we have a cleanup schedule. We have a maintenance schedule for dust suppression equipment. We want to read the manufacturer's recommended operational conditions. Change clothes at the end of the workday and inspect equipment before operating. All of these things they're often overlooked tasks that can really reduce your exposure to silica dust, or they can be sources of exposure if you don't go about maintaining equipment properly or your clothing that you're wearing. So keep in mind that beyond mixing and installing products, there are going to be some other sources to silica that you might have overlooked in the first place. So there are some additional work practices, rules that we want to follow in order to stay safe. You may also want to post signs to warn workers from other trades that your work may produce airborne silica dust. You could also organize your workspace so that the minimum number of workers are present in the area when dust is being generated. And the worst news for most contractors is that their beards are not reliable dust masks. OSHA says that workers who must wear dust masks must be clean shaven where the mask forms a seal against the skin. All right, a beard is going to prevent a dust mask or any kind of respiratory protective equipment from forming a seal and therefore filtering out all the dust. So if you want to keep the beard, it's all the more reason to use engineering controls to reduce silica exposure to below the action level.
The third control method is housekeeping. All construction sites require some form of cleaning up, and it is important that your housekeeping does not expose you to more silica dust. For that reason, OSHA says that dry sweeping of materials that contain silica dust is prohibited unless you can prove that there is no other feasible way to clean up the dust. Let me be clear about that. If the dust does not contain silica, it's still okay, according to OSHA, for you to use a broom to clean that up. However, if it's saw-cut concrete dust, then the chances are it does contain silica and you're not allowed to dry sweep. Also, OSHA has prohibited using compressed air to blow silica-containing dust off clothing or surfaces. Again, if you can prove that no other method is feasible, you can do it, but you will need to use respiratory protection while you're doing so. The last control method is wearing personal protection equipment, in this case respiratory protection or a dust mask. The reason why it is last is because people often don't use it properly. They pull it off their face to talk to other people, and then let it dangle around their neck for the rest of the day, or they don't get a good seal. OSHA considers a dust mask to be a type of respiratory protection and therefore requires implementing OSHA's respiratory protection standard. It requires training in how to use your dust mask, fit testing, and also being clean shaven when you do use it. All the steps you use to control your workers' exposure to silica dust must be documented in your written exposure control plan. You can find lots of templates on the internet for written exposure control plan. Some of them are loaded down with a lot of extra stuff. It's the old story of mistaking quantity for quality. The OSHA standard only specifies 4 things that need to be in the worker exposure control plan. You have to designate a competent person to oversee the program. For each task that may generate silica dust, you must identify the task, describe the control methods used to keep silica dust to a minimum, describe how you prevent other workers, your own or other trades, from being exposed to silica dust. OSHA has published a small book called the Small Entity Compliance Guide. The link to the document is found at the top of this slide. You may want to write down the link. I think we also have this in a later slide, so if you don't get it all written down at the moment, then or you can also review it later because it will be recorded. The guide includes...
I'll also send it out in the emails.
Okay, very good, thanks.
This guide includes a sample page for one task that is shown on the right is a sample page out of a written exposure control plan, and it lists all of the things which are needed, gives examples of what is needed to document your control methods. Okay, this slide expands the headings that you need for each page so you can see them as I go through them. You have to have the name of the company and the person who is creating the plan, who wrote this particular page. You need a description of the task. You need to describe all the control methods that are in process, including engineering controls, work practices, respiratory protection, what housekeeping methods are used, which generally will be the same for everyone because OSHA really only has 2 requirements for housekeeping. And last, you talk about procedures used to restrict access to the work area. And so, what do you do to prevent other workers who aren't engaged in the task from being exposed to silica dust caused by the task? That includes your workers and any other trades that are in the same area.
All right, now I'd like to describe some of the best practices to use. So first, you'll want to segregate dusty operations from as many workers as possible. Only essential workers should be in the dusty area. You can put up signs warning other trades, tape up plastic sheeting to wall off dusty operations, and even schedule the dusty operation for a time when fewer other workers are going to be around. So you'll need to designate a competent person. That's back on this slide here. You'll want someone who knows the materials, the equipment, all the possible ways of controlling the dust. And that competent person also needs to have the authority to take corrective actions. That might involve buying equipment that controls the dust, okay? And they could also be involved in scheduling the worker tasks, ensuring that workers doing the high dust exposure tasks get rotated to low dust exposure tasks, as Brian here talked about earlier, in order to keep those daily time-weighted averages below the action level. Again, that's the 25 micrograms per cubic meter of air. So you want to use the best dust suppression methods for each task. When you saw cut concrete, tile, or brick, you want to use a saw with water spray. When you're polishing concrete, you want equipment that's shrouded with a vacuum and a HEPA filter to remove all the excess dust. So naturally, we want you to use our product safely. We've done some testing with a product we have called Dust Free and some other vacuum attachments, such as a gutter hook or a whale tail, that go on the end of your vacuum's hose, and it can attach to the edge of the mixing barrel or hang down in the mixing barrel. So when you mix a powdered product or any kind of cement, these attachments can reduce the amount of silica dust that gets into the air. So we found that whenever you're drawing any excess air with that residual dust, you're drawing it out of the bucket or mixing barrel that you're mixing in, and it's reducing the respirable crystalline silica from being slightly above the permissible exposure level to being well below the action level. So we highly recommend using a kind of vacuum attachment or similar so that you can mix products and filter any residual dust out of the mixing container. An OSHA standard for construction will also recognize that filters themselves get clogged with dust. So changing filters is another task where there could be a potential exposure to silica dust. So your written exposure control plan needs to address this task. Again, the written exposure control plan has to account for any task where a worker could be exposed to respirable crystalline silica. So there are some vacuum units that have ways to shake dust off of the filters to prolong the filter's useful life. And the shaking can be done manually, or you can invest in a pulse vacuum, which will knock the dust out of the filter every few minutes automatically. And in all cases, I recommend buying equipment that lets you get the job done correctly in the job you need to do. If you don't have the right equipment, this new regulation may add time needed to complete a job, or it'll add expenses like exposure monitoring and medical surveillance, least of all the expense that it could be imposed by breaking one of the OSHA regulations. So here's a list of all of the items required by the OSHA Silica standard. All right, and some of these are going to be a little bit of a summary, but we're going to go back through them. We want to identify a competent person responsible for compliance and record keeping. We want to assess exposure levels for each worker, all right, and that's through Table 1 or objective data or exposure monitoring itself. We want to provide hazard communication training on silica risks and how to limit exposures. We want to develop a written exposure control plan. That's a document for the potential exposure for each task and how to address each of those tasks to limit exposure. We want to implement control measures to limit exposure, including the engineering controls, the work practices, the housekeeping, and respiratory protection if needed. We want to limit worker access to high exposure areas. And last but not least, we want to be able to provide medical exams to highly exposed workers as necessary. Again, if you're above the PEL, that's the 50 microgram per cubic meter of air permissible exposure limit, if you're above that for 30 days out of the work year, then you're going to have to participate in a medical surveillance program. All right, so that's another cost to the employer and another process that an employee will have to go through in order to make sure that their health is protected with the work that they do. So what have we done to comply? Again, objectively as a company, To assist our customers in compliance, we've tested the operations that a customer would normally do with our products, and we've measured the silica exposure time-weighted average for each. In our company, members of the technical department and the sales department will often mix and install products for demonstration purposes. So basically, we have to go through all of the same procedures that an installer would have to go through. So that's why we had to do some of the same testing. Again, we're not here on behalf of OSHA. We're just here to share what kinds of processes we went through to make sure that our own employees were compliant with the regulation when we mix and install our own products. So in most cases, we have recommendations for how to perform each of the tasks that could expose us to crystalline silica and stay below the OSHA action level. So some of the common tasks with our products that could generate silica dust are opening bags of cement, disposing of the empty bags, mixing the cement powder with water, sanding, grinding, polishing concrete surfaces, broadcasting sand into a damp-proof membrane products or any kind of an epoxy product, sand removal from those products, dust control. And we can tell you that sweeping dust with silica will overexpose everyone in the work area. Just by using a dry broom and sweeping across the floor, you're actually causing some of the respirable dust to hang in the air for a long time after that broom's put away. So we work with a certified industrial hygienist to reduce dust exposure from these procedures. We had the goal of lowering silica dust exposures as low as possible, and we're continuing actually to conduct testing for each of these procedures to make sure that we come up with a plan that causes us to be exposed well below the action level and to limit or eliminate our exposure with any possible task where we're working with crystalline silica.
Since none of the tasks involving ARDEX products are listed on Table 1 in OSHA's construction standard for silica, ARDEX has created our own Table 1 for normal operations performed with ARDEX products. And a lot of that information would be available on the ARDEX website, so I'll refer you to that. So again, this is a summary of best practices. We recommend that you follow the safety procedures as listed by OSHA when working with silica sand. Also, follow any recommendations provided by manufacturers of products containing silica. You will need to create documentation to demonstrate your compliance in case of a OSHA audit. So in that documentation, you'll have to identify the products and practices which could be sources of exposure to silica. You'll have to show how you implement best practices like engineering controls and safety procedures. And in many cases, you will have to conduct some testing to determine if there is excessive exposure, and then revise the work procedures as necessary if you find that the exposure does exceed the action level. And if you can verify that you're exposed by exposure monitoring that your work practices do remain below the action level, then you are in compliance with the silica rule. And you should remember that every company is responsible for their own compliance. Okay, OSHA has put out a lot of information, published a lot of information that's available on their websites, and you can see those on this slide. And highly recommend that you look into these so that you can make sure that you are in compliance with the OSHA silica standard. So, all right, well, at this point, I'd like to thank you for participating in this webinar, and we'll open the floor to questions.
It would also be a great opportunity to take note of some of the links that we've included here. Granted, this information is going to be available to everybody, so they could actually access the link directly off of the PowerPoint as I understand it. But again, jot down these links, definitely a good thing to check out. Forward any questions that you have over to Lizzie so that we can address them once we have our audio, and we'll just pick up right where we left off.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that you look at the small entity guide. Unfortunately, it's really long, but there's a lot of information in there that has to be covered in order to understand the way that what you need to do for compliance with this regulation. And so struggle your way through it, but it's really good information. It gives you examples of everything that you need to present in your written exposure control plan and other documentation that you need to ensure compliance.
Right, and to repeat again, because we haven't been audited by OSHA regarding the new crystalline silica regulation. So we aren't 100% certain exactly what they're looking for, but all of the testing that we've done and all of the documentation that we've created has been based off of what we learned from their website, from the Silica info link, and from the small entity compliance guide in particular. So basically, if there's any uncertainty at all as to what exactly is required, then I would say the more the merrier. Have documentation, have work plans, make sure you can identify every single task that could expose a worker to crystalline silica, and don't overlook cleaning, throwing away bags, throwing away buckets, anything where there could be dust. Like we said before, the particle size of crystalline silica that's dangerous is too small to see. So if you see any kind of dust, then there's the potential for that respirable sized crystalline silica particle to be present. So we want to make sure that we're addressing those tasks and just providing as much documentation as necessary. Definitely have a written plan. If you look like you're organized and you know what you're doing, and you really put some time and effort and thought into making some documentation to state that you're compliant, then it's probably, at least in my opinion, my take on it would be that it would go a long way in making sure that you're compliant with the regulations. So worst case scenario, should anybody walk onto your job site, having a resource that you can point to show that you've put some sincere time and effort into making yourselves compliant is going to go a long way to help you. Okay, well, to pick up here, these are the links for our emails. Myself and Dr. Brian Suddaby, again, I work in the technical department here. Brian is more concerned with the formulation of products and the raw materials and what we need to do from a regulatory standpoint to make sure that we abide by all the proper laws and regulations. So if anybody has any questions, they can feel free to reach out to us. Preferably now, whenever we can discuss your questions and possibly their questions that a lot of people have, so we can kind of clear the air in that regard. But as anything comes up moving forward, we'd be happy to be points of contact for you. If not to provide some real direct information on how to be compliant, we can at least share your pain and brainstorm with you and try to come up with the different procedures that you could use or different plans that you could come up with in order to be compliant, especially when using our products. But I'd like to think that any manufacturer, even if it's a competitor of ours or somebody who makes an accessory material, equipment manufacturers, things like that, feel free to reach out to them. I'm sure as a service to their installers, they'd be happy to help you out with whatever information that they can. Like we said earlier, you're really going to want to obtain some objective data because it can cut down on steps that you have to take yourself as an installer to be compliant. So if there's any information at all that you can receive from any of the suppliers of materials that you use day in and day out, any equipment, any installation materials, flooring or otherwise, try and reach out and see if there's anything that they could offer. They may have resources that they don't broadcast online, but they'd be happy to share with you. So it never hurts to check.
Okay, awesome. We do have quite a few questions here lined up. Looks like even though we are only doing some tasks for less than 4 hours, some GCs are asking that we do pre-PEL testing to prove that we are in compliance.
I mean, we're hoping that most people will be able to either use items off of Table 1, or they'll be able to find objective data from suppliers who are using the suppliers who have already done the testing themselves and are able to provide exposure data. So if that's not the case, then they will have to have some exposure monitoring done. There are some ways to reduce the cost of the exposure monitoring. I know that our insurance company has a program where they will allow us at basically the cost of running the test, that we can collect samples ourselves and then send them off for analysis to a laboratory. And then they'll be able to calculate out what the time-weighted exposure is for that job. But I have to tell you, working with an industrial hygienist is it's a good way to do it, because you have someone who knows the field exactly of what's supposed to be done, but it is also very expensive. And so if you can avoid that by having a different means of getting your data, then I strongly recommend doing that.
Right. To follow up on that, I think if you're doing a task that's, even if it's less than 8 hours and they're still requiring testing, I mean, I would venture to say try and use some of the documentation that I just discussed as an alternative. Try and say, look, here's information from the manufacturer that states if I use this product and I use this mixing method and I use this kind of protective equipment along with proper ventilation and everything, then I can be below the action level even if I'm doing this task over the 8-hour time-weighted average. Even if I do this task for a full 8-hour workday, I can be below the action level. So if you can use that as supporting documentation and then make sure that you legitimately are using all of the proper protective equipment, all of the proper ventilation, HEPA filters are definitely going to be necessary in order to make sure you capture that extra small particulate matter. But I would venture to say that if you can follow all of those recommendations and you have objective data that says that following those recommendations reduces your exposure to below the action level, then that should suffice as an alternative. And I know that we've had conversations with job site superintendents to discuss that sort of thing, and we've just tried to provide as much documentation as necessary so that extra testing wouldn't be required.
Okay. We have some other questions talking about PEL. Can we solely rely on the table to determine PEL if we are following all the other precautions? And if we have implemented best practices, when and how do we need to determine if we need to conduct testing? What does that look like, cost, how frequent, etc.?
I think that part of that is that you need to brainstorm a list of all the operations that could possibly cause exposure to silica dust. And if everything on your brainstorm list has been covered, then you have the information that you need. Either it's something that's on Table 1, something covered by objective data, or if those two cases aren't applicable, then you will have to do the exposure monitoring in some way. So if you can make up a list of every possible exposure scenario and you have all that covered, then you should be good.
Yeah, in terms of cost and frequency, I can't really speak for cost because I'm certain that every region is different. I can tell you frequency, as far as the regulation's concerned, they're going to state that if you're doing a task and you've performed air quality monitoring and you've been shown to be above the permissible exposure limit, then you need to start implementing some new control methods or a new work procedure to make sure that you're limiting your exposure. And once you've done that, I believe, Brian, if I'm not mistaken, that they ask that you bring or you conduct additional testing to confirm that your new work procedures are indeed reducing your exposure to below that action level. So basically, we've done testing a number of times here internally because there were some circumstances where we could have been above the action level of some of our tasks, and we thought that we could reduce our exposure. And so we've tried some new procedures. We've tried some things based on what people in the field have told us they've done that they said have worked. So we were trying to collect as much data as possible. And whenever we would bring in an industrial hygienist and try out the new procedures, thankfully we've found ways to reduce our exposure to below the action level. But if it's above, like I said before, you could have to implement new control measures or ultimately require your employees to have respiratory protection and participate in a medical surveillance program. It's not out of the question to have somebody mixing, like we've seen on job sites on occasion, somebody with a full hazmat suit and, full face respirator. I mean, that is a way to protect the worker from crystalline silica. It's just, if that's the case, they have to be fit tested and they have to be participating in an ongoing medical surveillance program. But if that's an avenue that an employer wants to take for compliance, and all else fails, then it is an option. It's just really what we're trying to do is provide you with enough information and documentation to be compliant without having to participate in any extra programs or invest any extra costs. You have anything else to add to that, Brian, based on your understanding?
I can tell you that being above the action level will greatly increase the cost and time that you need to invest in compliance. That if you do exposure monitoring and you find out that you are below the action level, you're done. You don't have to do any exposure monitoring for that task again, unless something changes in the way that you do the task. However, if you're above the action level, there's a schedule of how often you have to retest. I think it's every 6 months if you're above the action level. It's every 3 months if you're above the permissible exposure level. And they make you do it until you get 2 consecutive measurements that are below the action level. And so that gets expensive. And you want to be using the engineering controls and the work practices that will minimize your exposure. That's the simplest and easiest way.
Right, and again, just use as much documentation as possible for every task, even if it's cleaning up, even if it's throwing away the bags. I can tell you, for example, we found that there was a good deal of exposure that we could be subjected to just by throwing away the bags of our cement after we've emptied the contents and mixed them. I can tell you that you can sit there shaking the bag for hours and hours, and there could still be some residual dust that's up in the corners of the bags. And if nothing else, crystalline silica aside, any dust in those products is going to be a respiratory tract irritant at the very, very least. And safety data sheets will confirm that, and they'll state, even on products that don't contain any crystalline silica at all, no sand, there are still going to be some work procedures that you would have to follow in order to use that product safely. And carrying the bags very, very carefully to throw them away is a strategy that you can use to reduce your exposure. If you're not swinging the bags over your head when you're walking to the dumpster, you're actually going to limit the amount of dust that you put back into the air. So those are some of the simple things that we found could be sources of exposure that if taken care of properly, can actually reduce your exposure and help protect the workers. So I would say first steps, make sure you're making documentation. Second steps, check the safety data sheet, see if there's any extra work procedures that you could follow in order to use the product safely. They don't always have to do with crystalline silica, but providing documentation that you're following those, all of those proper procedures are definitely going to go a long way in helping you maintain your compliance. And it's at no added cost. It just takes some time for somebody to sit down and make a written plan.
Okay, we still have a few more questions. It is noon at this point, but we will continue for a few more minutes if Steven and Brian are available for that. If not, we can also email out these questions to them and they can respond, and I'll get that out at a later time. Are you guys available to stay for a few more minutes?
Sure.
Yeah, we're
I don't
good.
have a problem.
Okay. So another question, how can we determine the exposure for grinding concrete in a 20 by 20, I believe that's foot, it might be inches, area? Dustless shrouds and shop backs are used on the angle grinders.
Yeah.
So essentially, I guess, how would you measure that?
Well, in this case, we've done this. We have our technical service rep who does floor polishing do exactly what you're talking about. And to be very honest about it, it took us 2 tries to be able to get his exposure below the action level, because we found that we weren't using our equipment, combinations of equipment that were not compatible, and so we had to make some changes with the vacuum system that was collecting the dust. But that sort of information should be available from the manufacturer or vendor of the grinding equipment, the polishing equipment. So yeah, I can't really comment on generic equipment, but I can tell you that in the work that we did, we found that when we used the polishing equipment as recommended by the manufacturer and used it with a good vacuum system, we were able to get the exposures below the action level for that task. And we did the task and extrapolated up to a full 8-hour workday time-weighted average. And so, it is possible to do that with proper equipment. And you shouldn't have to do the exposure monitoring because the manufacturer should be able to provide that information.
Yeah, to try to oversimplify what Brian said, you should be able to use grinding or polishing equipment with proper HEPA filtration on a vacuum shroud attachment that would allow you essentially to grind or polish a surface all day long without overexposing yourself. And by all day, I mean a full work day, not literally constantly. But basically, you should be able to contact the manufacturers of those equipment. They should be aware that their equipment is being used to perform jobs that could expose a worker to crystalline silica. I can tell you that there's a study that I read where they were analyzing a what they call LEV, what is that, local exhaust ventilation?
Yes.
But not necessarily HEPA filtration. And they found that the workers were overexposed when grinding or polishing concrete without the HEPA filtration. Therefore, I would venture to say if you want to do that 20 by 20 space or 100 by 100 or 1,000 by 1,000, whatever size, you're going to need that shroud to have a HEPA filtered attachment. And it has to be properly fitting. It has to be the proper equipment. Basically, don't try to create a hodgepodge polishing machine like we once did. Use all of the proper, as recommended by manufacturer equipment, and you should be fully compliant. It's my take that a manufacturer of grinding and polishing equipment is not going to be in business very long if they can't provide filtration attachments and vacuum systems that work well with their products.
Yeah. One more point I'd like to make on this question. We found that it was definitely beneficial to have a second worker with a vacuum system when it was time to change the polishing discs to go to a finer grit disc. Having one person do it, it just became difficult to keep the amount of dust that was accumulating inside the shroud to keep it contained. And the second person was able to come in with a separate portable vacuum with a HEPA filter, and to be able to clean that up in the process of changing the discs.
Okay, I think we have another question. Looks like that one's a repeat. Do you know if there is a required CFM for HEPA vac on sanders?
I think ours was 30. We've gotten that question before, and I don't hear about it very often.
Yeah.
Cubic feet per minute filtration?
Yeah, I think that probably is going to depend on the size of the hose that it's connected to. It's going to be dependent on exactly what type of equipment you're using.
So do you think that would be a recommendation that the manufacturer of the equipment itself would make based on hose diameter size?
Yeah, we don't manufacture that type of equipment ourselves, but I think you can probably get the recommendation from the manufacturers of the HEPA vacuum equipment to be able to help you out with that.
Yeah, I know. I think to summarize, I think we had a 2.5-inch hose diameter, and we had a 30 CFM for our vacuum system.
Okay.
Whenever we were testing the mixing of our sanded materials and all those sorts of tests that required basically a HEPA filtered shop vacuum.
Yeah, I think if you're polishing a floor, it's going to possibly require
Larger.
even higher CFM vacuum equipment.
Okay. Is there a standard for the test methods used in the evaluation of your products in ARDEX Table 1?
I don't think so. Not beyond what we read in the small entity compliance guide, correct? Which simply asked us to identify tasks and come up with ways to reduce your exposure. Is there anything beyond that?
The test method for, and correct me if I'm going off in the wrong direction, the test method for measuring the silica exposure of a worker, the one that's used for this would be NIOSH 7500. Might be an M after it. And then the other test that's used is to measure total respirable particulates, not just silica. That would be NIOSH 600, I believe. So those are the tests that you need to have done if you're doing your own exposure monitoring.
Excellent. Thank you for that information. Are your documented test results available to us for use on our WECP?
You could contact us, myself specifically through technical services. If you, we don't have anything available in the public domain in terms of our own test results, only because we periodically do some updated testing. But if you're trying to develop a written exposure control plan, you could feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to discuss our results with you and share some of the more specifics of the information. So long story short, go ahead and feel free to reach out to me if everybody has my email. If you're using any of our products, we'd be happy to provide our recommendations on how to do so while remaining below the action level.
Okay. And this is the last question. Are there 2 or 3 companies that you recommend for engineered solutions? An example, shrouds, vacuums, HEPA, etc.
I'm not sure, only because again, it would vary. It would vary by region. So I know that we don't use one specific brand of either shop vac or polishing equipment. I know that we have several, and we have locations that are spaced out here in Pittsburgh, Georgia. We're out on the West Coast in California, and I think each of those facilities would have different equipment. So unfortunately, I couldn't necessarily make a more specific recommendation, but I would just ask that you contact them and ask questions. Mention that you are looking for equipment to do some specific tasks, things that aren't necessarily covered on OSHA's Table 1. Because OSHA covered a lot of tasks that have to do with concrete, but there are some things that kind of fell by the wayside, some things that are too specific that weren't necessarily addressed, and mention that you need to work with especially the cements, patching materials, tile and stone setting materials, and you need to do so in a way that's safe. So see if there are manufacturers local to you that have the proper equipment, and again, just ask questions. See if they can provide attachments, HEPA filters, any other kind of component of their machinery that can help you stay compliant whenever you're doing that work.
Okay, there's one more point I would like to make.
Okay, sure, go for it.
A lot of people ask us about the information that's on the safety data sheet. And the safety data sheet is a document that's designed, required by OSHA, and many people are confused because even some products that do not have any sand added to them still have crystalline silica listed on the safety data sheet. And the reason for that is because OSHA requires reporting any crystalline silica greater than 0.1% of the product. And there are other components in the cement powder which do contain trace amounts of natural impurities of crystalline silica. And so on our safety data sheets, we report that because it is required by OSHA. However, we've also done exposure monitoring with products, I guess I won't mention the name of patching materials, yes. ARDEX patching materials that have no sand added. And what we found is that in a monitoring over a 8-hour workday situation, that there was no detectable crystalline silica in the exposure monitoring test. So, we can't really address what other manufacturers' products are like, but we can tell you that in our product, even though it does list crystalline silica on the safety data sheet, we were not able to find any crystalline silica in an exposure monitoring test, even though we had the worker doing the work that you would expect in an 8-hour day. And so many people are not exactly understanding why there's that there will be very low exposure, even though it says on the safety data sheet that there is crystalline silica present. It's only present in a trace amount, which is still reportable according to OSHA.
Right. Basically, OSHA requires us to list the hazard if there's any potential for exposure, but it doesn't necessarily address the risk or what your actual chances of being exposed to that material might be. So from a regulatory standpoint, we're required to list required to list silica sand, because it could be a residual component of the naturally extracted materials, the sand or the cements, some of the fillers that we use in our products. even though there's trace amounts that are reportable based on what you could see, because the product is extracted out of the earth. We actually tested and found the exposure was very low. So there may be some things listed on a safety data sheet that don't actually reflect what your exposure could possibly be. So that's why it's important to inquire as to each and every product that you're using and make sure you understand what the possible risks could be.
Oh, and one further point is that safety data sheets from Europe do not require listing the trace amount of impurities of naturally mined materials. And so if the safety data sheet comes from Europe, it will not list crystalline silica unless sand itself is added.
Okay. We do need to wrap it up now. We're about 15 minutes past our usual time. So thank you everyone for joining us today and for all the excellent questions. And thank you so much, Steven and Brian, for presenting today. You guys really shared a lot of your knowledge and your experiences, and we really appreciate that. All registered attendees will receive a copy of the presentation, and the recording will also be available on the FCICA Member Center, as well as through that direct link back to GoToWebinar. And just one more reminder for the certified installation managers who attended today, your CEUs will be added to your accounts. If you were part of a group and I do not have your name from the login, just have your group leader, whoever signed in, let me know that you were there watching, and then I can give you your credit. If you are looking for other continuing education opportunities, you can access previous webinars on FCICA's YouTube channel and Member Center, and visit our new training resources page for other offerings. If you are interested in sponsoring an FCICA promotional or educational webinar, you can contact me by email at elizabeth@fcica.com or by calling FCICA at 248-661-5015. Thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.